ACCA, and I'm here today with Alison Maitland, business author and journalist, to talk about expert panels which were carried out by ACCA and the Economic and Social Research Council. There were 3 roundtables that focused on diversity in business and how to harness that diversity for business performance and innovation. So, Alison, thank you for joining me today. Can you tell us a bit about your opinion piece, which really opened up the discussion for panellists?
Yes, well, diversity is pretty diverse in itself and quite diffuse sometimes. So in the opinion piece, I really sort of homed in on 5 key pillars of sustainable business growth and what the link between those was and diversity or the lack of diversity. So those 5 pillars are new talent and the importance of getting the right talent and diverse talent into your organisation, new markets, innovation, and that's where the idea of constructive conflict and having different perspectives comes in, because there's a lot of evidence that leads to greater creativity and innovation. And effective business structures, which meant looking at some newish business structures, things like, well, obviously the virtual businesses that are growing very rapidly with the internet, things like social enterprises, employee democracy, and also some cross-sector partnership type organisations. And then the final pillar that we looked at was leadership capability, which is absolutely crucial.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Can you provide us with a quick overview of what panellists' views on diversity in business were?
Yes, well, on diversity itself, they really had quite a very strong consensus that diversity was crucial to business. But at the same time, there were some differences in terms of the place that diversity or the role that diversity plays in business. So for quite a lot of the panellists, particularly in Delhi, they talked about how diversity was an absolute staple. It was the starting point for successful business. It was actually about survival. And one of the Delhi panellists, for example, talked about how India itself is an incredibly diverse nation with many different cultures, many different religions, many different peoples, and food habits and so on. And the point that panellist was making was that Indian managers are very used to dealing with diversity, and therefore the argument was that they make successful global chief executives because they can handle diversity very naturally. On the other hand, there were panellists, particularly in Shanghai, who argued that in order to achieve diversity or to have a diversity drive in your organisation, you really needed to have a very important business case in order to do that. There wasn't any point in just sort of saying, oh, well, we must pursue diversity for its own sake. So that was a different perspective, and that we talked about what that business case was, and it could be a sort of carrot or a stick, really. So a carrot business case would be, for example, going into new markets and therefore having diverse talent in order to understand those diverse markets better, for example. A stick element of the business case for diversity would be something like legislation, so bringing in quotas legislation or something like that. So government action, which is forcing companies to do things.
A formal approach.
Yes, yes, exactly, a more formal approach. And then that led us into a discussion actually about the sort of the short-term cost of diversity, potential short-term cost of diversity versus the long-term benefit. The short-term cost coming about because quite often it is more difficult to manage a very diverse team or a diverse group of people with lots of different perspectives, bringing different perspectives to the table, and it may take longer initially to make decisions and to get things done. But everybody agreed that there was, a longer-term business benefit. But the question was, how long would it take, and how big would the short-term cost be? But one of the panellists, interestingly, in Shanghai, sort of turned that question around and said, actually, what we should be saying is, what is the cost of not being diverse as an organisation?
So it doesn't sound like a simple equation of it's a plus or a minus.
Well, not entirely. I mean, there's bound to be a sort of good and a bad side, or not. Perhaps good and bad isn't quite the right way to describe it, but certainly a positive and a negative side. There's a tension that's emerging, particularly for multinationals, I think, because they really increasingly they need to understand the many different cultures, different peoples in emerging economies, in the rising economies. I mean, China and India, incredibly diverse countries, and have many different cultures within them. So international companies need to understand those markets, because those are going to be the markets of the future. And at the same time, they're actually increasingly fighting for talented people. I mean, they need, obviously, to be recruiting people from India and China into their companies in order to understand those markets. But they are increasingly competing with local national companies that are growing very fast. For example, in China, it's now the case that a lot of young Chinese who used to think that working for a Western multinational was a great way to see the world, to get a great career and so on, post the financial and economic crisis, they're increasingly turning to local Chinese companies, because those companies are growing very fast, they're expanding overseas, and they are then therefore giving people the opportunity to have an international career and international experience.
So the terrain for competition's always changing.
That is increasing, yes, very rapidly. And one of the other interesting things that we touched on in the trends was actually connected with that. It's about how to date there has tended to be in diversity terms and in terms of culture sort of a Western cultural dominance. So international business, global business has been very much sort of seen through a Western lens, and the kind of attributes you need, like speaking up and being assertive, has tended to be seen as a potential leadership material. And now I think one of the things we touched on was really an understanding that there has to be a more nuanced approach to this now, and that global policies, global diversity policies, for example, really need to be adapted and implemented locally, and to take account of other cultures and the importance of those other cultures, because those other cultures are becoming increasingly, the dominant cultures.
So what do you think leaders need to do to harness this diversity and make these changes?
Well, leadership was actually really, the key thing that came out of all the panels. We looked at all of those different pillars, but actually, talent and leadership were the things that attracted the most attention and most discussion in all three cities. And what really came out was that leadership, that diversity really all starts and ends with good leadership, with having the right leaders. And leaders, in order to really achieve diversity and to harness diversity in their organisations, leaders need to be open to other people, to other cultures. They need to be very adaptable. They need to be willing to be challenged themselves. They need to really understand, and as one of the panellists said in Delhi, they need to be able to understand and appreciate and embrace other cultures, not just with their minds, with their brains, but also with their hearts. So they need that really is about the openness that's needed. And we had some quite interesting examples of both, good and bad leadership. And people made the point that if you don't have the right leaders at the top who are willing to lead and really accept diversity, then you're not going to get anywhere with diversity. It's a sort of, a dead in the water. So that is why it's so absolutely vital.
That sounds like a key message. Are there any other key messages that came out from the expert panels?
Well, I think that the question about leadership then led to, well, how do we train leaders? How do we prepare leaders for to lead really diverse organisations and to set the right tone at the top, and to learn to be sort of first among equals rather than the big boss of the past, which of course that means that there needs to be quite a bit of culture change, really, because In cultures like in China, and we discussed this, in China it's people may well be much more used to a hierarchy, and in India too, a hierarchy where they obey what the boss says, what the manager says, and in order to sort of draw out the best of people's strengths and the diversity of your team, you really need to, as a leader, you need to be a kind of first among equals rather than that big boss telling people what to do. So that led to a discussion about the importance of cross-cultural understanding and cross-cultural intelligence being a really important leadership trait for the future. And of course that is important as part of leadership development itself in organisations, but in London the point was raised that perhaps we actually need to go further, and we need to be teaching young people in school about cross-cultural intelligence and cross-cultural understanding, because yes, exactly, starting early. And so that really came through. Understanding and accepting and working with other cultures is going to be such a crucial leadership attribute for this very fast-changing world.
On that note, I'd like to say thanks again, Alison, and thanks to everyone for joining us today to hear about the 3 roundtables, the expert panels on diversity in business. Thank you.